So if you think about some of the disruption that we have experienced over the last 18 months, among many things, global remote teams have opened up this really complex debate on compensation strategies. And it seems like if you're looking at Twitter or LinkedIn or anything going on, everyone's kind of got their own hot take on what should the future of compensation strategies be given new norms of working. And so the big question, how do you compensate those organizations? How do you compensate global engineering teams fairly and competitively, especially in new markets? So with that, we have joining us Nguyen, founder and CEO of OpenComp, and we have Cyrus. Cyrus is the GM and SVP at Hatch Labs to share their experience. So let me give you a quick introduction to both of our speakers here. So Tan is founder and CEO at OpenComp. He's helped thousands of tech companies with their compensation and HR strategies. And these are companies like Airbnb, Figma, LiveNation, Lyft, Uber, and many, many others. And so he'll be sharing his experience with us today. So I'm moderating our conversation is Cyrus. Cyrus claims to have dabbled in the software development space since the first bubble. He's the GM SVP at Hatch Labs, which is a globally distributed group of crafters. Tan, Cyrus, welcome both of you. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Take it away.
Thank you, Patrick. Tan, this is great, man. Really, really excited to have the opportunity here to speak with you. And you know, the topic of compensation, I mean, there's so many facets to it, right? And you obviously have a tremendous amount of experience here in the space, whether it's partnering with founders, investors, companies, small and large. And, you know, myself having, you know, sort of tried to understand this and ramp up on this over the last couple of years, you know, really want to understand there's all the different areas, right, when it comes to comp, whether it's salary, bonus, equity, benefits. You know, kicking off a new startup here, you got to have a plan. And I think understanding what it means to create a plan there. You know, where do I begin? Like, what's the right approach here? What are the first steps?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the biggest things that I've always talked about over the years is outside of just, you know, paying more or less or how you're paying to market and what you're defining the market. It's really a common theme of trying to be consistent. And consistency is not the notion of paying everybody the same, but how do we get to a program where we can share that we have a consistent approach in how we bring people into the organization from a comp and equity perspective. Now, you know, how do we start thinking about that? I mean, look, I think one of the biggest things is planning. I really try to focus on doubling down in that planning area, especially now with distributed workforces. You've got to understand who's being impacted really, because it may not necessarily be your whole product and engineering team, right? You know, what roles, where, and bringing in your partners. I mean, your talent partners, even your finance partners are going to be critical in spending a lot of time developing that hiring plan out, you know, because when you do the work in establishing, whether it's cities or thinking about regional talent areas that you're going to try to hire a lot of folks in, that's critical in establishing a consistent pay structure and a pay philosophy. And, you know, all those inputs from your recruitment team around talent and what type of talent is important as it relates to the overall development of, you know, how you're going to mark your pay for those roles. And I think the other thing is when we're talking about this, you know, you have to be very cognizant about when you're opening up the remote aspect, how's this going to impact your current team, right? Have you addressed how you're going to handle the normalization if somebody's moving from a high, you know, pay market to a lower pay market? And, you know, we're seeing a lot of companies make those determinations where, you know, I think it's, there are few companies out there that can say, hey, we're just going to pay based on Bay Area rates, and that's going to be our standard. I mean, if you can do that, that's, you know, obviously it becomes, you're much more competitive from that dollar and equity perspective. But I think most companies are not going to be able to do that. So when you think about that, what is the strategy when you normalize somebody? And it could be, you know, time-based and then maybe an offsetting bonus when they are normalized. So, they can kind of phase into that. But those are all important aspects, and you got to have those discussions well in advance before you kind of say, hey, we're going remote. Let's go figure out where the best talent is.
Right. And with regards to that, I mean, you have the different geos, right? It's trying to understand the talent. And as part of that plan, how do you look for, consistency in terms of the pay, right? Consistency in terms of thinking about those bands.
Well, I mean, look, when especially, in the comp space, in the comp game, you really got to get to the data, right? Whether it's data coming from recruitment, I think there are a lot of folks here that are know about Radford, they know about probably our own data set and option driver or option impact. Whatever you determine to use, I think you got to make sure that you're using the right data set. And that data set obviously is heavily influenced on the stage and the industry and the geo. And believe it or not, we still get a lot of customers or prospects coming in saying, hey, we're just using data solely based on our recruiting efforts, or just kind of this data set that somebody provided us, or we're just looking at self-reported data. And they're basing their strategies off of that, right? And I think that's that's a kind of a troublesome methodology, because you really want to be thoughtful about defining that, because that definition leads you into really getting your pay philosophy, established, and that's simply your market positioning strategy, and how you're going to set up your cash versus equity bands, right? And those are really the groundworks for scale, right? When you think about, again, if we're pushing this out to geos and having our baseline, how do we get to establishing of those pay bands and equity ends for the varying levels of expertise for our employees?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned data there and just being well informed. I mean, that was something I know we spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out, how do we make sure we've got the right data? And certainly we started out trying to be globally distributed. And of course, the events of the past year has kind of accelerated that adoption. And so really understanding what are you mentioned Radford, right? I think is obviously one people are familiar with. Serendipitously, we got introduced to OpenComp. And it was just really helpful to have it not only as another data set, but as a way to model and help with that planning. As part of the planning, and now that you have sort of the data set, tell me a little bit just in terms of the compensation transparency, right? So if I'm gathering the data now, what is my responsibility to make sure that I'm transparent with it? And what does that exactly mean sort of within the company?
Yeah, this happens all the time, or this comes up all the time. Like, transparency to some is, hey, we should be showing, base salaries and equities for everybody in the organization. Now, we don't believe that's probably the best use of data. I think, when we talk about transparency, it's around the ability to transparently talk about your programs and your strategy, right? You have to be able to get to a point where you can communicate your overarching philosophy that ultimately links to the programs that you're going to deliver, right? Whether it's the merit cycle, the promo, refresh, performance cycles, they have to be thoughtfully communicated to your employees. And more importantly, those are the actual drivers that, support what's been, planned from a finance and a burn and a dilution perspective, right? So when you think about going off and building out a comp strategy and not having all that groundwork laid forth, you really can't be transparent, right? And transparency, again, is not, so-and-so makes X, Y, Z, and I make this, right? And I think that's really troublesome for companies that try to do that.
Yeah, and again, going back, I mean, it requires that you have an informed plan, right? And you have that data, and homework, so to speak, done ahead of time. In a couple talks back, I think it was Regina, when they were talking about DEI. How do you think about DEI so that it's not an afterthought, right? So we're thinking about it as part of the strategy and not trying to apply that at the end where it's, obviously not going to work.
Yeah, and I think, Virginia hit it right on the head in terms of it takes everybody to deal with this. But I think from a data perspective, I think, certainly with compensation and kind of dealing with that, we need to try to get tactical and develop the analysis, right, that supports information for your hiring managers, for your recruiters, and for the organization, so they can actually measure their own kind of composition and their own understanding of gender and pay. And I think, a lot of times when we're trying to do these programs, and there's questions on how to address it, I've asked our customers, like, have you gone through the process of analyzing your pay as it relates to gender and diversity? And most of them haven't, to be quite honest with you. So if you don't know what you're doing, it's hard to actually activate change, right? Because what you want to do is establish at least a baseline and show a road to change over time. Now, there's a lot that goes into that process. It's the attraction of those diverse candidates, but it's also, more importantly, the retention of those candidates as they, stay and develop their career in the organization. But, from like getting analysis, that's a huge piece of evoking some major change in this area, because we have customers that are using our D&I tool and analysis at that recruiting level, right? So they can inform and now bring knowledge to the recruitment team as it relates to departments that they're recruiting for, and they start to understand the gaps. And that's a open now conversation with hiring managers that is tangible, and they've got numbers behind it. They know how they're paying within these categories. They know what the deltas are. Now it's their opportunity to use that information to act on it and use other programs and other providers to support that top of the funnel, and then everything else goes behind it in terms of making sure that those individuals get hired and are integrated and are successful in their cycles with the company. Right.
Yeah, I mean, being objective is so important, so that you are basing it on something, right, that's concrete, and then being able to be consistent with that. Obviously in the technology space, it's highly competitive, right? And there's certainly the mission of a company that obviously attracts talent. But if you're starting out and you're trying to get those first few hires in, right, that first, engineer, do I overpay for an engineer, right? Do I increase in equity? Like, what is it that I'm running into, right? And the challenges there if I take a misstep right out the gate.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a misstep, but I think it's acknowledgement that you're going to have to make some major trade-offs sometimes, and most of the times, especially in the earlier stages. I think even for us, we're growing our engine product team, and one of the core things that we've tried to do before we really set off was to establish, again, going back to taking the data and building what was optimal for us from a finance perspective on how we wanted to use our capital and kind of our dilution goals as well, and really kind of map that out, right? So you're trying to somewhat solve for talent and what you're going to face and the demands on the talent aspect. And then you're going to try to solve for the bottoms up of your affordability. And at some point they're going to meet, right? And that's where the planning and developing ultimately your salary bands that make sense for you, whether it's in, headquarters or the geos that you're going to hire into, right? Once you start to do that, you're better informed on the trade-offs you're willing to make for the different types of skills that you want to bring in at certain times. So, I mean, the most important thing that we talk to our customers about is, look, when you're making those heavy trade-offs, don't let those exceptions be the norm, because there are a lot of folks that are moving really quickly and they're using this kind of previous higher comp strategy, well, we hired somebody previously at this rate, so it's probably, we could probably do it again. And if you're not careful, you look back and you've got a really distributed, inconsistent pay strategy and equity. And then you've got to do a lot to clean up that, right? But again, it goes back to what we've been talking about, getting solid planning, getting great data, and starting to develop that philosophy and that structure. Because we all know that there's going to be a lot of opportunities for your candidates to get paid more or take on more equity or more dollar value equity, et cetera. I think it's just really important to have knowledge and have a structure that says, look, most of your hiring is going to be comprised within the standard bands that you feel comfortable with as it relates to where you're at in your business. Okay.
So having a plan, consistency is key, but understanding there's going to be some agility there along the way, with that consistent mindset, so that you don't end up with something that now you have bands and folks out of band all over the place. So then add in for me the geography, right? I mean, the Bay Area obviously is competitive, and then you have all these different markets in the U.S., and then now you expand it, globally. How should we think about geography when it comes to hiring? Like, what's the focus that one should be mindful of?
Yeah, I think, look, again, we're facing this. We just recently hired somebody that they're in South Carolina, right? And he actually told me that he's thinking about moving to New York, right? So, that's great. We think he's fantastic, but the implications of that now are we've got to set up a South Carolina entity, and then the New York entity probably post that, and that New York entity could be 3 months away. So what are we going to do during these waiting periods? So I think there are these other implications, and we talk about this kind of, you obviously talked about this notion of the iceberg. You've got comp, it's really clear, and you've got equity there. But, when you're planning this out at scale, you've got all these other operational needs. And I think for us, even, when you think about a company at our stage, which is less than 25 folks, I'm still using kind of contracting ops support, right, from finance, et cetera. So if we're going to move to 10 states pretty quickly, that's pretty onerous, and there's a big cost to setting all of that up for our folks. And I think we got to be mindful about how that could potentially slow down and really kind of the engagement of that employee if we're not effectively set up to onboard those people in those regions, right? And that's where I think when you're thinking about doing or establishing these plans, having more regionalized hiring goals is pretty appropriate, I think, because it allows you to develop these structures that are really focused on kind of those labor markets, right? And we don't want to, have a situation where you're trying to price out every specific job, right, or every specific job in each location, because I think it might just not be that effective for you. The delta between pay might not be that, that much of a save, quite frankly, given all the operational load that you're going to take on to do that. And we've seen companies do that, and that has been their feedback. It's just like, hey, we're really going to try to rethink this, associate, and build those bands back to a model that we can really scale with, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's so true, right? I mean, one of the things we encountered is just trying to understand the various markets, just the legalities of it, right? And so you kind of, initially you're thinking comp, in terms of budget, hey, it might be a little bit more cost effective to target these regions. And then, there's an added sort of wrinkle of, candidates have to give, advance notice of 2 months. And so now all of a sudden there's a timing, aspect of it as well that folks sometimes don't realize. I guess briefly tell me, in terms of a PEO, so professional employer org, How does that are there considerations there when thinking about comp and then bringing on somebody external to help as part of the hiring?
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty critical. I mean, if you've got, for example, a long period before you can actually hire somebody, and we all know this in the hiring process, that the more that you have to interject time, there's more risk in losing that candidate, right? So you want them to get started with your organization as soon as possible. But if you're waiting on an entity to start somebody, now you have to really think about having a PEO of sorts to hire that person on. Some people would say, hey, let's just put them on as a contractor, a 1099. But there are implications with that as it relates to the EDD and states flagging whether you're a 1099 and a W-2 employee in the same year. And you get enough of those, you're going to have to go through an audit, right? And when you think about those implications on those audits, and not to get too much of a scare tack on this, but that takes a lot of time away from what you need to be doing and the resources that are redirected. So again, the sooner you can get your head around where you're going to hire, you can start to plan for all the subsequent resources that ultimately lead to that individual or that employee coming on and onboarding and having a very streamlined process with you. Because we're facing the same thing right now, right? And we have the luxuries of seeing a lot of this data and talking to a lot of folks, but yet we're facing similar situations in terms of trying to move really quickly and trying to hire folks in the same way most of our audience is doing as well. So.
Yeah, definitely. Coming back to if you've now kind of established, right? You kind of have your geos established. You started to scale a team. One of the things I'm encountering now is just thinking about the market gaps with the existing employee base. And so what are the areas there that I need to think about once you've kind of established, you got your geos, and then looking at, things are shifting, or as you mentioned before, folks want to move, South Carolina to New York.
Yeah, and I think there's when you're dealing with existing employees, you could have some very compounding effects depending on how you're paying them today. If you feel like, hey, they're currently performing really well, or they're exceptional, and we feel like we're paying them well below market already, but then they determine that they're going to move right to a different market that has either a higher or lower pay structure, then you've got to make those decisions fairly quickly, right? And you've got to come up with those actions to shore up your employee issue there, right? And the best way to really solve for that is to do a competitive analysis against your ranges or against your market data that you're using, so you can get ahead of what that cost would be, so you can apply those market adjustments where appropriate. Now, the reality is you might not be able to solve all your kind of gaps in pay, but you want to start thinking about the performers that you need to address as a priority, right? So that's absolutely very critical as you open this up, because your employees are going to look towards those locations and maybe want to move there, and you're going to have to address them fairly immediately.
So making sure you constantly have that data, that feedback loop that's always informing.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think Patrick, sounds like we got a couple of questions.
This is always happening to me. This has been I think the phrase of the last 18 months. You're on mute. For patience. So one question that came in from Michael. It seems that employers and employees often use different sources for compensation data.
Yeah.
Have you encountered issues with this misalignment of candidate expectations in the role? And and what would you recommend to minimize the difference in expectations of compensation?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the biggest problems, right? I think, like simply let's just bring up Radford, for example. We've got a lot of early stage companies using Radford, and there's like varying surveys, right? And we're trying to educate our customers on like, hey, the equity data that's being represented in their global survey is based on public company data. Now, is that appropriate to use for a company that is a Series A or Series B? So this is part of the discussion, and this is part of the training that needs to be had with talent and managers as well, because you've got to be able to catch this, because there's just so much, there's just a lot of myths around data, or just simply of, hey, basis points. I've got this many in basis points for this company, and I've got 20,000 shares here. I believe it's worth this. I don't believe it's worth this. And I think that drives people mad. It drives managers mad. It drives candidates really mad around who do we believe? And that's why many people don't trust compensation, right? And it goes back to, hey, what is our philosophy and our strategy? And really define, this is the data we use. This is the where this is coming from. This is our market positioning strategy. And this is how we think about establishment of our salary and equity bands. And we do it in a fair and a consistent way, right? And if you're able to have those, I think you're able to cut off a lot of these preconceived or myths out there around, this equity package is worth more than that, right? Because we all know that, it's all notional value anyways, until you get a point where the company really does have legitimate enterprise value, and you can actually see that head towards an exit.
Thank you. And one final question, Tom, because I think earlier today we had a couple folks share two sort of competing trends around the future of compensation, and so it's sort of this dilemma between localized versus like globally normalized compensation. And I don't think the question is which one should people do, but rather I'm curious to learn, how would you help somebody arrive at a decision that's right for them to determine what their strategy is for localized compensation versus globally normalized? Is there a certain framework or approach that you would help people come to the conclusion for like what's the best approach for them?
Yeah, I really believe we somewhat talked about this. There's the operating and running the business, right? Because we all have to operate under an operating plan, a budget of sorts. And then there's the talent, right? So that's going to ultimately come together as we talked about. And I think when you start to say, hey, we're going to have a global strategy, right? And that global strategy is going to be based on this set of data or market principles, and you're going to run that out in terms of your modeling, which you should, because that's how you're going to build out your financial plan. And you're going to understand if there's going to be pressure on your abilities to do that. And based on what you are establishing there, the real test is from the recruitment aspect, is there going to be, the ability to hire, or are you going to ultimately win or lose? And also, from the current employee perspective, are you retaining your staff? And that's just not from the standpoint of comp, but it has an input into that, right? So I think you have to do the workup on both ends and test that, because that's going to ultimately help you back solve the right approach, right? Because it's got to fit both models successfully, right? To assume that you're going to go off and set a plan and not have it within your financial envelope, I think, that probably wouldn't work out very well from a board and investor or shareholder perspective. Right.
Thank you. Thanh, Cyrus, thank you both so much for your time. That's all the time that we have for questions. This has been an incredible exploration around compensation. I've learned so much that wasn't even on my radar to consider around building out our team. And so thank you both so much for generating really important insights for our community.
Thank you.
We'll see you later.
Thanks as well.